Welcome all to this Physical Review Fluids Journal Club event for September 2022. Today, we will be discussing the paper Mixing by Stirring, Optimizing Shapes and Strategies, which appeared in Physical Review Fluids in 2022, authored by Maximilian Eggl, who is at the Institute of Physiological Chemistry, University of Mainz Medical Center, and Peter Schmid, who is now at the King Abdullah University of Science and Technology in Saudi Arabia. I will request Dr. Maximilian Eggl to switch on his slides and give his presentation. Kindly note that we will take questions at the end of the talk. You may either enter your questions in the chat box, or you could raise your hands and we will take questions one by one. So over to Max.
Yeah, thank you very much, Kumaran. And yeah, thank you so much, everyone, for coming. This is going to be my talk. I think I have 50 minutes, so I won't do too much introduction. But this is the work I did with Peter Schmid during my PhD and then later on during my various postdocs. And it is mixing by stirring, optimizing shapes and strategies. So I will give this talk. And then afterwards in the question session, Peter will join in and help. And if you have any very difficult questions, please put them towards him and not towards me. I will answer the easy ones and the fun ones. Anyway, so let's get started. I'm sure you all are wondering, why do we look at mixing? Well, mixing is one of these questions, right? Why would you want to study any sort of question in fluids? And mixing is one of these very key ones because mixing is absolutely everywhere. There's some of you watching from the United States where you just woke up and I'm sure you have a cup of coffee. And if you want to mix that with your milk, well, how are you going to do that? Right? And that's one of these questions. But mixing is not only in your home, it's also in your cars, it's in the industry. It's just one of these ever-present processes that can really benefit from being studied. And I have this kind of key fact that I'm never going to change, and I put in every single slide or every single presentation I give because I just think it's so good. And that comes from the Handbook of Industrial Mixing. Now, this fact comes from the US chemical industry from 1980. Well, it's a bit dated. Maybe 1989 is not the most update time, given that it's almost 30 years ago. But still, I believe these facts hold and maybe even have gotten worse. But the fact is that bad mixing in the US chemical industry in 1989 led to over a $1 billion loss. So that's back then in one industry in one country. So if we can enhance that and make that better, well, even a 10% improvement could have significant effects, right? Not just financially, but also in the energy purpose and then quality of the actual resulting mix. So there's a lot of benefit there that could be done if you optimize or study mixing. Now, before I get to my beautiful results that I'm sure you're all here for, all the fancy videos, we do have to get into the nitty-gritty of the actual math behind it. And so given that this is a fluids talk, most importantly, all our simulations and all our work is done using the Navier-Stokes equations. So this should all be very familiar to most of you. We have the Reynolds number, but we also have this extra term, which is the passive scalar down here. And that is what we're going to be used to track our mixing. Now, the most important non-dimensional number here is the Peclet number, which is the ratio of advection over scalar field diffusion. And given that we're also studying binary fluids, well, our passive scalar has to start as something. And so in that case, we have a binary fluid, which is 0 in one fluid and 1 in the other. And basically everything's great and dandy when everything is a half. So that's how we're going to try and mix. But when you actually want to mix, you have to think about what does it even mean, what we want to optimize, right? How do you define mix? How do you say that one thing is more mixed than another? And so when I started my PhD, I looked in the dictionary, and mixing in a very technical way was defined as the reduction of inhomogeneities in the passive scalar field, which doesn't really mean very much to us when we want to try and optimize it, right? So there are a lot of things out there like the mixing quality, which is one of these terms, but the one we wanted to focus on, the norm that we focused on, were these Sobolev norms of fractional and or negative index. Why do we do that? Well, if we look at them, they look relatively complicated, right? It's almost, K is a negative of fractional number here, so it's almost like an antiderivative. But what this does is it actually allows for both local and global effects to be considered in your optimization. I'm not going to go into too much detail because I think we get stuck in the nitty-gritty, but you're more than welcome to look at the paper of Matthew et al., which kind of talks about this. But one of these things that's very natural to see would be, for example, if your K is 0, well, then you would get your variance, which is a very natural way of thinking about mixing, right? If your fluid is more varied, well, then you're going to have a high variance and less mix. And if you have 0 variance, well, everything's the same and you're very well mixed. But we can't just do this, right? We also need constraints. Well, why do we need constraints? Well, first we need the mathematical constraints of the system, right? When we do our optimization or our simulations, we want our fluid to actually act like the fluids given by the Navier-Stokes equations. Cool, that's what we need. But we also need something else. We need physical constraints. And this video, I believe, illustrates why we might need physical constraints. This gentleman decides to mix his coffee with a drill. And we see the result is not very good, right? Because in the end, he's not going to be, well, maybe it's good, maybe it's well mixed, but the person's not going to be able to drink it. So we do need constraints on how we mix. So on one hand, we might want to limit the energy of the stirrers available to us, right? But if we only limit the energy of the stirrers, this is kind of an integral. It actually turns into the problem that it's a semi-norm, right? So if we have then velocities that were delta functions, right? They have finite energy, but they're infinitely fast. Well, that's going to be a problem as well. So probably need to limit the velocity of our stirrers. And finally, because the nature of our mixing strategies relies very much on vortex shedding, so accelerating back and forth, if we don't constrain our acceleration, then we might lead to strategies that just aren't feasible or don't make sense. So these are the kind of the 3 key concepts we need to constrain. So going on to the actual simulation or the actual geometrical implementation, we're going to start with a circular 2D domain. We have considered this as future work to work to 3D, but everything I'll show you here is in 2D. But still, even with 2D, we have such a wide range of things we can look at. We have our embedded stirrers with constraints, and within that, we can optimize for shape, we can optimize for velocity, we can optimize for rotation of the stirrers. And that's just the initial studies that we have now. We actually can do a lot more later on, and that's what we're thinking about doing. And numerically, we're going to be treating these fluid structure interactions with the Brinkman periodization and a basic code called fluidity, which we have extended quite significantly and added an adjoint version and everything on top of it. So what do the Navier-Stokes equations then look like? Well, all the terms in blue are those extra penalized terms. So when chi, which is the mask that defines your solid, is 1, then you're in your solid and you get these extra terms. But you notice when chi is 0, right, you just get normal Navier-Stokes back. So in the fluid domain, you just get normal Navier-Stokes, but when you have your chi equals 1, you have these extra penalized terms. And you note also here we have this u subscript si, which is the velocity of each embedded solid, right? So that if you take your solid and move it through the fluid, then the fluid inside that solid is going to move as well, right? And this is a lot of work, this Brinkman penalization stuff. It's very well, it's validated and all these things. So it's quite well used, especially in combination with these pseudo spectral codes that we based our work on. Now, the key thing we have to think about, and I mentioned this before, is we use adjoints. Now, what is adjoints? Well, whenever I talk to anybody who doesn't know what an adjoint is, I just call them like Lagrange multipliers on steroids, right? But they allow you to turn a constrained problem like we have into an unconstrained optimization problem. The adjoint variables basically enforce the constraints that you wish onto the system. For example, our mathematical governing equations. They then contain the sensitivity and gradient information you need to be able to then make things better, right? Any sort of gradient-based update or optimization uses these adjoints to know where to go. So what does this look in kind of practical or imaging terms? We start with some initial shape, I'm going to call it chi0 for our stirrers, and some initials like velocity. Could be anything else, but I'm just going to start with these two. And we feed these to the governing equations. And we say, okay, now you have this shape, and you have this velocity profile. What's going to happen? And you get some information out of that. Well, then that information you get, this u and theta, which is your velocity field and your passive scalar field, the result of your mixing, you can then feed that back to these adjoint equations, right, with this dagger notation. And they give you information that allow you to optimize your strategy. Well, then what you do is you can keep going over and over again. So you keep going around this loop over and over again, keep getting a better and better and better strategy until at the end, we get some chi or US that we say, that's it, because we can't do any better. We've stopped or we've reached the limit of what we can do physically. And that's what we say we've won. And we don't say necessarily that we've optimized, but we say we have enhanced our mixing process. Now, we've done the whole maths behind it, right? We've talked about the fluid structure, interactions, the codes, and all that. And we actually talked also how to optimize. But when we think about this, we don't want to just stupidly go into our optimization and say, here we go, that's it. We actually want to try and get some physical insight from this, right? And so the question we really want to ask us is, how do we actually mix, right? And I find this picture, which is completely unrelated to our research, but I found it, and I think it's just such a good place to start, because it kind of, it exemplifies exactly what we want. But before I can tell you what we want to do, I have to give you two fundamental concepts of mixing. Passive, a diffusive mixing, or advective, which is active mixing. What do I mean when active and passive? Well, active means we put in energy into the system, and then we move stuff around and things get mixed. And then when we have passive, we don't put anything in. It's just a thing we get for free from the system. Things are going to diffuse and mix out. So why do I then mention this picture, right? Well, in this picture, we see very, very many small filaments, like kind of these pulled out strings. And they have very high surface area, which means that diffusion can like do even better. It can do even more mixing, right? So what we want to do, and this is a strategy we think would work, and it actually was verified, and this has come from other papers as well, is we want to create as many small scale structures as possible, these thin filaments, and then use those to diffuse away. We get that for free, right? So if you just basically make everything very small, well, then your mixing is going to be done basically for you. And the nice thing is that mixed norm we chose before, the Sobolev norms, do exactly this. They focus on creating as many small scale structures as possible. So before I move to the actual paper that we talk about today, I kind of wanted to show the inspiration that got there. And we've done 3 previous studies that worked on this. And the first one was just the basic framework that I've been talking about, which used a very stupid problem of like just optimizing eccentricity and rotation. And it makes sense. Basically, we found out that when you want to mix, you want to do things faster and you want to have higher eccentricity. The point was more to validate the framework and make sure everything works. But at the same time, we were able to see that our adjunct optimizer was actually relatively smart. It was able to ignore stirs that were having nothing to do with the mixing and focus really on those with its limited energy constraints, those that could really have an effect. And what we see here is the middle one. The middle one really goes off, and those side ones don't have an effect at all. Well, so once we started with that, we said, okay, now we can do a lot better. And so then we decided to look at shape optimization. And we wanted to see whether within the constraints of we don't have any faster rotation or any more energy, just with the shape, can we achieve better mixing? And we did this with relatively complicated shape parameterization with Fourier modes. And we got some really wacky shapes that did really cool stuff. But we actually learned a lot that I'm going to talk about in a second. And finally, and this is the most complicated optimization we did, is because the velocity along a path is a time-dependent variable. You can change the velocity at any given point. And so that means you have like a super high dimensional space of like 10,000 variables that you need to optimize. And still, we were able to get very good results intuitively with quite robust mixing. And so given that, well, what do we want to do now? And this is kind of what I'm talking about at the paper that we talk about now. And given it kind of makes sense, right? We looked at shape and we have velocity. So what is the effect when we look at both at the same time? Well, we can look at all the insights we've gained from shape and from velocity, and we can apply them to this extra problem. So on one hand, let's see what we get from the shape optimization. Well, the funny thing was when we used this Fourier optimization for our shape, the optimizer was actually cleverer than we had expected because it was able to basically make filaments so small in the shape that they would twist off, and then they would get 2 stirs instead of 1 for free, which we didn't want, right? Because we constrained the number of stirs. So we needed more robust thickening and twisting to really kind of to nail this optimization down. But with the fact that you can move now free in space because you can optimize your velocity, your obstruction, the fact that you can place stirs somewhere and they don't use energy because they just mess around with the vortices that come off, can be done so much more effectively. On the other hand, on the velocity, well, most importantly, energy, acceleration, and velocity need to be penalized, right? Because otherwise you're going to get wacky strategies like hypersonically shooting your coffee mug. It mixes it, but doesn't make it drinkable. But we also wanted to see, because vortices became so important, we really want to allow a bit more time in the optimization space, so the stirs were able to move a slightly bit longer to really see if they take advantage of these vortices. And I'll talk about the vortices a bit more when I show the results of this paper. And finally, because we wanted to look at a different parameter regime to see if we could get the similar fluid or mixing strategies, we looked at a more viscous kind of implementation. And in this case, our Reynolds number was 100 and our Peclet was 10,000. But, and this is something we wanted to figure out because we hadn't studied it before, does the order of the optimization matter? Or in fact, does it matter if you optimize at the same time both quantities, or can you get a better result by doing kind of a leveling? First shape, then velocity, etc. So let's look first at the shape optimization. So on the left, we have the control strategy, and on the right, or the control/baseline, and on the right, we have the optimized shape. We see that the velocity profile is exactly the same, and the only thing that changes is the actual shapes of the stirrers themselves. So why are they different? We would expect that there would be kind of some sort of symmetry. But we notice actually that the top and the bottom stirrers are slightly different. How so? Well, the top stirrer goes faster than the bottom stirrer, so different strategies arise. On one hand, the outer stirrer concentrates on the generation of modified wake vortices because it's so much faster. Its trailing edge can allow for many more sheddings of these vortices that then interact and create super cool mixing patterns. And the inner strategy, which is slower, uses this bluff body strategy. Basically, what it tries to do is push as much fluid from one domain into the other so that the other stirrer's vortices can take advantage of that and create that mixing. Okay, cool. Now we have the shapes and we can optimize their path velocity. So what do we see here? Well, we see a significant change in the actual velocity profile, right? The top stirrer, instead of kind of going around in a constant fashion, actually plunges into the interface, bringing a lot of velocity or fluid with it, but at the same time, generating multiple more stop-start vortices. You see it goes really fast into the interface and stops a bit and then jiggles around. Now, more collaboration is also possible. You see that the stirrers wait for each other. And at the end, the inner stir kind of does a shift back so that it can interact with the vortices that come from the bottom stir. So really a lot of collaboration is coming from this relatively clever optimization pattern. But we have one more question, right? We want to see, does it matter if we change, if we do now both combined at the same time? And so when we do the combined optimization, we start again from the baseline, and then we do both shape and velocity at the same time. We see that the shapes that have arisen from this optimization are much more simple, right? Because when it did the shape optimization, it basically only had that to rely on. So it tried to do the best it could. But with this combined optimization, well, it says, well, I have the velocity. That's going to do really good anyway. I'm going to just shift the shapes a tiny bit just so they're good enough for what I need. And what does it do that it needs? Well, it basically shears right alongst each other. So instead of moving in parallel with each other, they shear against each other, creating a field of very high velocity or pressure, sorry. And that in the end leads to these high number of vortices being shed. So there's this incredibly more interplay between the shape and the stirring strategies, right? It knows just as good, how much to make the shape bigger so that we can get a shape that is physically feasible, is able to be simulated, and leads to better mixing results. So with all of that, we have now the best result after optimization, which makes sense, right? So after optimizing both things together, where it is able to take that interplay in a much more significant way, it is able to reach a better mixing result. So what have we done? Well, in conclusion, and this is kind of the wrapping up slide because I know I'm running out of time, we've actually managed to implement this kind of optimization regime with mixing, right? And we have this incredibly difficult problem that is very hard to pin down with a lot of parameters, and the optimization is huge. But we're able to get very intuitive results on our mixing strategies. They like vortices. Vortices generate extra stirs that allow it to kind of mix up the field, right? We also can do this with energy constraints and velocity constraints, right? And there's so much more we can do here. But before I keep on going, I have to talk about the limitations and challenges. Of course, there's the elephant in the room is we're using gradient descent, right? Or gradient-based optimization. And we're a nonlinear problem. So this local versus global minimum problem really comes about. But even we don't care about optimization so much or optimality. What we care more about is enhancement. Finally, the parameter regime. Well, turbulence and adjoints don't really go well together. So we've worked in a regime where we have this semi-laminar flow where you still get a good signal to noise ratio. But with turbulence, this is not really that possible. And finally, with the adjoint, the nonlinear stuff, you need to have a lot of saving of memory to actually run your adjoints. And this can lead to excessive memory requirements. Finally, and I kind of leave the slide up here of all the things we can do. We can talk about non-Newtonian fluids. The framework is independent of that. we could look at wall geometry, and this is something we're currently going to start researching, wall movement. But there's so many more things to do just with the 2D geometry. But finally, moving to 3D would also be something very, very interesting. And so as I wrap up, I'd like to say thank you very much to everyone. Imperial College, obviously at Princeton, where I did most of this work, and the Joachim Herz Foundation, which funded a lot of this work, and then obviously the beautiful face of Peter Schmid. And I'm going to wrap up here and say thank you very much. And I'll show you this cat simulation that I did for fun to validate some of the numerical simulations. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Max. It was a wonderful presentation. Those who want to ask questions can kindly put it down in the chat box, and we will ask them in sequence. I had a sort of basic question. You said that we should try to get as thin filaments as possible, and then diffusion will enhance mixing. Now, you can get thin filaments only if diffusive effects are small, right?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, the thing is, if you look at fluids that have very high diffusive, and this is like, I think if you look at the cat video, everything is already diffusing almost immediately, right? And then the idea is like, you don't actually do very much by doing advection. So in the case where you have like, we're kind of only interested in the regimes where diffusion isn't so dominant. Because for example, things we would like to look at, and this is maybe more kind of in the future when we look at more industrial studies of things like non-Newtonian fluids, we look at something like we want to mix toothpaste or paint or something that would like there's very little diffusion there. And so then we want to try and maximize it in that case as well. Hopefully, I kind of interrupted you there. I'm very sorry. I wonder if that answered your question.
Yeah, no, I was just asking, is there some optimal spacing between filaments that depends upon the diffusion coefficient so that, you generate the filaments of the correct thickness and then they mix due to diffusion optimally?
Most likely there probably is, but I think this would require significantly more asymptotics than I'm able to do. But yeah, there probably is some relationship on the actual Reynolds number or the diffusive effects and how thin your filaments need to be. We haven't considered that.
Okay. A question from the chat box by Jason Durr. Really beautiful results. To what extent do you think they can be imported to MHD fluid equations? In what ways might the results differ when electromagnetic fields are included?
I mean, Peter, do you want to take this one? I feel like I've talked for a while.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. So that definitely can be carried over. The mixing still will be defined by the Sobolev norm that Max talked about. The difficulty that comes on top of the MHD fluids will be more in the constraints. So in that case, you would have a lot more constraints on the parameter space than we actually had to deal with. We had to deal with velocity, time, and acceleration because everything was vortex-based or vortex-shedding based. If you throw in MHD, you also have to have additional constraints so that the magnetic part and the electric part are not basically diverging. So in principle, it can be done, but I think most of the thinking has to go into the constraints to keep the optimization feasible.
Okay, thank you. Sander Huisman asks, maybe I missed it, but the energy injected by stirring, integration of velocity dot force, the same for all the...
This is actually, this is a really, really good question. And this is one we get a lot. I think this is something I got in my PhD viva and in several reviews. It's the idea that, well, we're talking about like velocity and like being injected like this, but we don't actually ever consider torque, right? And that's kind of the measure of this idea of force. And like if you have a longer stir, then obviously if it's further away, it's going to be able to have a much more high effect. And so, yeah, this is something that we're thinking about implementing into the code and doing like an optimization study of, is what happens if we also have to restrict the torque, right, onto these shapes, because obviously if we don't, then we might generate shapes that are just break off once you actually implement them in kind of a physical space.
Thank you. Eckhart Mayberg, how difficult would it be to extend this framework to variable density flows?
I mean, yeah, I think the framework itself is independent of the density or of the flows themselves, right? As long as your governing equations kind of are Navier-Stokes, and you have some sort of like some equation that defines how the density kind of goes through the fluid, then the framework works independently of that. Now, as I think Peter talks about with the MHD, it's just going to add extra parameters we need to think about. But in reality, I don't see there being a lot of a problem. I think that the difficulty wouldn't be that big, because also we're thinking about non-Newtonian fluids. And I think in terms of that, that would also be something that goes in a similar direction. It's not variable density per se, but it still has like the whole effect of a fluid is slightly different.
Thank you. Dopazo, how about using the transport ratio for the scalar gradient, where the relevant physical mixing mechanisms explicitly appear? Example, flow, strain, molecular diffusion.
Peter, I'll give this one to you again.
All right. Okay. So scalar gradient can be used as well. In a sense, the mix norm that we have is already a scalar gradient, but with a negative index. So what Max actually demonstrated is we should not concentrate on the small scales. We should actually concentrate on a cascade of the large scales and their breakdown into small filaments towards the small scales, because at the small scale end, diffusion will take care of it. So in a sense, we have to have a measure that feeds the cascade towards the smaller scales and to smaller filaments. So in that sense, a scalar gradient would work, but actually integral of a scalar gradient would work even better as the one that we used.
Okay. Bob Riedenthal, it would be interesting to see the approach to the mixing transition above which the mixed fluid at high PE is essentially the vortices. Can your technique appreciably vary the Reynolds or the Peclet number?
This is actually some, I mean, yeah. You take it, Peter, you take it. I've been talking a lot.
Okay. First of all, hi, Bob. Good to see you. Yes, we can vary the Reynolds number and the Peclet number quite independently and over quite a bit of a range. It's a matter of resolution, of course, if we introduce the smaller scales. But as we also increase the smaller scales, we also have to most likely increase the power of our Sobolev norm, of our mix norm, because there is a longer stretch over which we actually have to work on that cascade towards the smaller scales. So as we push that limit to higher and to smaller and smaller scales for higher and higher Reynolds number, our range over which we actually do the cascade optimization varies. And that one needs to be dialed in with the power of that Sobolev norm.
Yeah, and something that I would just like to say is that there is a study that Com Caulfield is doing as well, which kind of is related to this work. But he doesn't have embedded stirrers, but he has like his optimization is actually the velocity field at the start of the optimization. And there they basically, their study is like what happens at different Peclet numbers. That's their, and this is almost the same framework as what we're doing now. And I think they have an archive on it as well.
Thank you. Difficulties to extend this methodology to turbulent 3D mixing with or without chemical reactions.
I mean, so this was part of the limitations I talked about, and this actually touches on two of the limitations. Right? So the first thing is turbulent. Turbulent is always going to be an issue because adjoints, so when you have turbulence, you just get an insane high noise ratio. Like the signal to noise ratio, basically, you don't get any information back. There's some work being done on kind of extending adjoints to turbulent regimes, but it's still like it's quite computationally intensive, and it's something we haven't done. So we're going to restrict ourselves to anything less than turbulence. And then, like when we talk about 3D, well, 3D is very possible. The difficulty there is not necessarily in the actual methodology, but it's in the implementation, right? Because we have, if you do instead of n squared number of grid points, you have n cubed. That's just going to like put your computation time up another level. So the 3D and the turbulent is going to be difficult, but the chemical reactions I don't see as being so much of a difficulty because you just need to add an extra equation onto it, right? And the equation just has to be, you know, something reasonable about things mixing or changing. And then that just feeds into the framework. So 1 out of 3 are relatively easy. 1 out of 3 is possible, but computation intensive. And the last one is like something we're not going to be looking at in our studies, But like, I'm super happy for anybody to look into it. I think it would be really interesting to look into turbulent mixing.
Thank you. Zhiyang Wang, how many grid points in the 2D cases are needed to obtain grid-independent results?
So when we started this study, we went way back, and I had to learn all about this Fuzzy and this whole like penalization approach. And the thing is, the actual Fuzzy code is very well validated, has all these stuff. So when we started looking into it, I started off with something stupid, just though things would run in like 128 by 128. But yeah, we realized that there wasn't quite grid independence yet. And so when we ramped it up and we took it by factors 2, etc., we realized that when we got to 512, and this is where we are now, 512 by 512 is the grid number that we have grid independent results. We also make sure, for example, you need for the soluble so you need to divide by the actual size of the grid. So there's several things we've done to take grid independent, like to make it grid independent. And I was going to say something, but I've completely forgotten now to answer that point as well. But hopefully that answers that question. Oh yeah, no, sorry. But the videos you saw on the presentation are actually upsampled, right? So we just for visualization purposes, we upsample them to 1024 by 1024 by 0 padding. They just look nicer. So we don't get extra any physics in there, but it's just to make things sharper. But the actual results, the actual solid norms and optimization are based on a 512 by 512 grid.
Thank you. One final question, Nausheen Basha. Can you please comment on the number of iterations carried out for the shape before optimal shape is found?
So first things first, I'd like to say, and this is because we're gradient based and we're nonlinear, I don't want to ever say, like, I feel bad to say that this is the optimal shape, right? Because it's not. There's probably some optimal shape given that we're not trying to find the best shape, we're trying to find a better shape. But within the constraints that we have found, this is the best shape, or the enhanced shape that we can do with. And I think for the actual shape optimization, purely the shape optimization, I actually found it really hard because it's still based exactly it cannot do anything with the velocities. And so it's kind of stuck in the strategy from before. So I think it took 11 optimizations. And then it hit the point where it was going to start breaking things off and it was going to start making stupid shapes. And so we stopped it there. The stopping criterion was like, is this still feasible? Is the like minimum width of the shape still being maintained? And that's kind of where we stopped there. Sorry. But for the like the combined optimization, it had many fewer iterations because it can just like really quickly with just the velocity optimization get to the point where it can do better. And yeah, so that's kind of the comments on those iterations. But yeah, they're very fast. And this is kind of one thing I didn't say in the presentation, is that adjoints are actually very, very powerful in this sense. Because if you do anything else, because maybe reinforcement learning might be a way to tackle this problem. But for that, you need so much data for all the different parameters you can change. But the nice thing with adjoints is that you basically optimize all parameters at the same time with one run. Technically, we do 2 or more, a couple more, because we do this checkpointing stuff. That's fine. But so we do 10 iterations, but you're doing only ordered like 2 times the number of governing equation solves.
I think we are at the end of our time, so we should close this discussion. I would like to thank Beverly, Brad, and Kenny at the APS for organizing this meeting. I'd like to thank the organizers for presenting their work and answering questions, and to all of you, the audience, for attending this talk. Is there announcement that the editors or Brad would like to make before we close?
Nothing to add, apart from to add our thanks to everyone who joined us, and to you for hosting it, Kumar. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. Those who would like to discuss further, is it correct, Brad, that they can stay on and discuss further if they want?
Yeah, we can stay. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I'll keep it on for a few more minutes. Yes.
Yeah, so Brad will keep it open for a few more minutes. So whoever wants to ask any further questions or discuss something is welcome to do so. Thank you all once again, and see you at the next event. Thank you.